Right then, this video is a response to a video created by, I believe his name's Stephen, and he has a YouTube channel called Rationality Rules, and the video is called A Second Referendum Debunked. And I'm pretty sure that, correct me if I'm wrong, your position is that we should be having a second referendum. My position, I haven't necessarily made up my mind one way or the other, but I'm going to take the position of that if the points made within the video are valid from a philosophical point of view, are the arguments valid? But I would like to say one thing before we start, is that I've seen some response videos where it gets a bit maybe emotional and combative, and in any response video I'd like to sort of almost pretend as though that person is in the room listening to our critiques, and so it doesn't get personal. It's just it's a philosophical conversation, or a conversation about ideas even, where we talk about the points, we don't talk about the person. So would you like to clarify anything before we start?
I'd like to say that yes, I am, I hope, never of a set opinion, and therefore I'm open to changing my mind. In fact, I actively invite people to try and convince me that I might be wrong about something, because the only way you can ever grow as a person is to come out of your comfort zone and actually accept other ideas, and that you might not always be right. And one of the biggest problems I have at the moment, things that frustrates me the most, is that I see everywhere people who are determined that they are correct. From born-again Christians all the way through to any kind of radicals, all the way through to politicians, where their ideas are the correct ones, and they're going to defend those ideas. So you get, two political parties, for example, or two people in a debate. I mean, in my school they had a debating team, and the idea of the debating team was actually not really to debate. Not the way I understand the word debate. Maybe debate should be the word of the day, because my understanding of the word debate is that it's a brainstorming thing where you come and you actually debate a subject. In other words, you discuss a subject and try and form, hopefully at the end of it, if you've done a good job, both of you come away with more knowledge than you went in with, because you're sharing knowledge, which after all is the whole point in communication, is to share knowledge. There's no point in talking or even having body language if you don't actually share it and be able to understand and interpret it from others. And so it frustrates me that people are, and politics, and you see politicians defending their, the party line, and whether they agree with it or not, and constantly trying to convince others that they are correct. It just frustrates me. So I think when I watched the video, I saw quite an intelligent young man, clearly intelligent young man, but with a bias. And his bias, in my view at least, is clear that he was against having a second referendum, pro-Brexit. And in fairness to him, he was trying to give rational arguments for why he is correct. And I don't think that's correct. Okay.
The one thing that I wanted to ask you before we get into the point-by-point analysis that I've done is that he mentions a couple of times in the video, and I wanted to say to you, would you accept a second referendum of sorts if the vote went in the other direction? So if it were the case that we actually voted to remain, and the other side of the, if the Brexiteers said we would have another one based on similar or the same criteria, would you accept that to be a valid thing to promote?
Sure. Yes, I would, is the answer. The point is, I'm not necessarily right, and nor is anyone else. In fact, most people are wrong the majority of the time about everything. So, and I'm no different from that. I think one of the problems or the inconveniences with democracy is that other people get their say, and it is inconvenient. If we voted and they had this referendum, which I didn't want in the first place or see the point in, I mean, for me, as far as I'm aware, the main issue with the referendum was because of infighting within the current main party, especially within the Conservative Party, where it was sort of tearing itself apart. And ironically, the referendum has actually, the result of the referendum and all this Brexit process that's gone on since, has literally torn that party apart. I mean, in the local elections, they lost over 1,000 seats or 1,400 seats or something.
Sure.
I don't know. Council seats, this is. But it is, in my view, the referendum was by the Conservative Party, and I may be wrong, but I understand that it was to avoid infighting because that party was falling apart, ripping itself apart because of this Brexit issue. You had people on one side who wanted Brexit and people who didn't on the other. And the main problem was you had a new party called UKIP. And, we all know the reasons. We've discussed them before. So, I'm not going to go into the reasons behind Brexit. And these are, my filter has interpreted these reasons one way. Someone else will interpret it another way. But, one of the main things that people voted on was immigration. And the fact of the matter is that this had an influence on the results. Right or wrong, regardless of this or that or the other, the point of the matter is that if you took a stand, whether it was on immigration or any other reason, and you decided that you wanted Brexit and the main party wasn't going for it, the Conservatives, if you were a natural Conservative voter, which I have issue with as well, not being Conservative but being a natural voter for any particular party, I think you should be picking and choosing. But if you were a Conservative voter, generally speaking, but you wanted to come out of Europe and there's this new party called UKIP coming along, then, you're pretty tempted to vote for UKIP, right? And it's basically tearing part of the Conservative Party away. It's creating a smaller, less powerful, less important Conservative Party. So it makes sense for the Conservative Party to have this referendum and put it to sleep once and for all, so that we've had a vote and it's Remain, so shut up and let's just get on with it. Except it didn't work out that way. It kind of backfired. And people said no. Maybe people were voting as, they'd had enough of the Conservative Party and they were voting against it because they didn't like it. Maybe a lot of the Labour parties, natural Labour voters, voted against the party line that the Conservatives have, which was to stay in Europe, to remain, as a protest vote. I mean, who knows the reason why people voted? Everyone has their own reason, and they're all valid in their own way, right? I might not agree with them, but they're valid. So the same goes the other way. If we had another referendum, I'd go back and I'd vote, and I'd still vote the same way because I still think that we're better off. I think the European Union is flawed in many, many ways, but I think we're going towards whether we like it or not, globalisation. And I think the European Union is simply a step in that direction. And it's an inevitability that we'll go down that way. And therefore, we shouldn't be trying to fight it. We should be swimming with the current rather than against it. And I think Brexit is trying to pull back away. And I've heard arguments saying that, no, Brexit is about becoming more international. But it's just, just stop fighting and just go with it and try and make the most of the future, rather than looking back towards the past. And this is, one of many reasons why I don't think that I would vote for Remain again if I were to vote. But if I want a second referendum because I think a lot has changed. And I think some of the things that, I for one, never thought that if we were going to leave the European Union, it'd be so complicated. This divorce procedure, or so expensive. And it didn't occur to me because nobody really mentioned that, or at least I never, not in great detail. Maybe they didn't know. So I didn't even know. But certainly the Brexit that most people have voted for is not the Brexit they're going to get anyway. And it appears to me that the government are desperately trying to do all they can to get exactly the same benefits that we currently have within Europe, but without actually having the rules determined in Europe, which inevitably really means that we end up, if they can achieve this, which I doubt they can, then we end up exactly the same, but without any power within Europe, which isn't in anyone's interest, in my view. So I can't see any real benefit to Brexit. I can't see how we as a people are going to see our lives improve if we're outside of Europe. And I can't see how they're going to improve if we're in Europe. They'll just stay as they are. But one thing I can see is this infighting and the current sort of, I don't know, blocking point that we can't seem to get round is definitely detrimental to our life in the UK and to others elsewhere. So yeah, I would sorry, I'll just I went off on one there a little bit, but to answer your question, I absolutely would welcome a second referendum, and even if we'd voted to remain, if things changed, I think part of politics and one of the inconveniences of politics is that people have a right to change their mind, and we should always be asking people what they think. Theresa May said we can't have a second referendum because we need to enact the first one. Once we've enacted the first one, then we can talk about potentially having a second one if it doesn't work out the way we want. That seems just pointless to me. What we should be doing, in my view, is saying, okay, we haven't yet enacted the first one, but are we going the right way? Is it how we wanted? Is it time to have another vote? And if we voted the other way and we said, no, we want to remain, then I think we'd still be having a second referendum at some point. I mean, in actual fact, it would be a third referendum because we've already had a referendum on Europe in 1975. In 1975, funnily enough, almost 17.4 million people voted to join the EEC, the European Economic Community, which was actually something like 64%, 64% of the voters in those times. So it's quite a clear majority, actually, voted to join the European Union in 1975. So you could argue that we've already had a referendum on it, and therefore we should respect that referendum and not have a second one. Well, I disagree. We voted to have one. I didn't want a second referendum now. I don't think it's in our interest to have had a second referendum, but we had a second referendum, which most people consider to be the first one. And the first one voted in my favour, and I've really benefited from it. I've had the ability to go and live in Spain. My wife came to the UK to learn English. She's Spanish, and she had that right because of the European Economic Community and the freedom of travel, and so on and so forth. So I've massively benefited. I mean, you could argue that maybe my children wouldn't have been born without it. So these things have a huge impact on our lives. Freedom of movement, I think, personally, is a fundamental human right. The only people who impede movement are governments. Before countries were invented, you could wander wherever you wanted. And if you came across another tribe, they might kill you, or they might welcome you, or they might ignore you and let you go on your way. But you had the right to travel. Nowadays, you can't even cross a border without a passport, except in Europe, funnily enough, where you can.
We've had a bit of an open borders debate before, so I won't go into that again.
No.
But
we don't have an open border though in this country. We never have had.
Yeah, and I would say that's a good thing. But we've discussed it. But I wanted to make. I think that you'll think that this is interesting anyway. But the quote in the video is. A second referendum with an option to remain in the EU would mean the death of democracy. So that's a quote from the video, and I thought that's a claim. So you have to have evidence to back up your claim, and I thought, is there evidence to the contrary? And there are actually lots of instances of governments not enacting the will of the people, and the most recent example was in July 2015 when the Greek people voted by 61% to 39% to reject harsh austerity policies sought by the EU in exchange for a billion pound bailout. Despite the vote, the government in Athens, fearing the country's banks and economy would collapse, agreed shortly afterwards to even tougher austerity measures. So they went in opposition to the will of the people. I would say to benefit the country overall.
Probably right, yeah.
And the next one was the previous one.
Sorry, just before you, can I just make a very, very short point? I promise it will be short. There's a TED Talk, really good one, by the guy who was voted in to be the Minister of the Economy for Greece. And he did a TED Talk, 15 minutes, and he came in saying he was going to do all these changes. He was going to put his finger up to Europe and stand up for the Greek people, and then he changed his tune. And he talks about it very openly about why he changed his tune and why you go into politics thinking you can change things and how you really can't, and you don't have the power you think. Very, very worth watching. Just 15 minutes. A real rare privilege into the world of power. And much respect goes to that guy because, he tells it how it is.
Okay. The other example is in 2008, Ireland became the only country to hold a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, and voters rejected it by a majority of 53%. Irish and EU politicians urged people to think again, and a new referendum was held in 2009, and this time 67% of voters backed the treaty. So there's a couple of examples of European countries who had a second referendum and then, or not even a second referendum, the government just essentially said, that's not in our best interest to do, and they still have democracy. And so I would say that's evidence to the contrary, that if we were to have a second referendum, that wouldn't be the death of democracy in the UK.
It's an outrageous claim. It's a bit like, to me, that claim is a bit like saying that, that the sun goes round the earth. It's just seeing things from quite a specific point of view, and a little bit naive. I don't mean to have a crack at him. I think many, we're all naive and we're all guilty of that. But no, clearly, as you've said, it's not. It would be possibly a real problem, and even possibly the death of the current political party. I mean, the Conservative Party, because they would be directly, or as far as people are concerned, or many people are concerned, they would be going against the will of the people, therefore could no longer be trusted, etc. So it would be a huge problem to them, and in fact is a huge problem for them. As I talked about earlier on, I think, as far as I'm aware, the main reason we got this in the first place was because that political party was losing power with the upsurge of UKIP, because there was a real, to me, it all comes back to economics. All of these politics are based on economics. If everyone's wealthy and happy with their money and not struggling, then everything is very in the middle. No one really wants to change anything. And why would you? Life is lovely. It never has been for everyone, but for the majority. But when things start going out of kilter and there's an economic crisis, party politics starts swinging to the more extremes. So you get people much more on the right, much more on the left, and there's much more swing, much more instability, more racism, more everything that goes negative that goes along with it. And we've seen that. We're living through that right now. Previous times, after the Great Depression, we've got World War. I mean, these are, after the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles, the French put incredible reparations on Germany to the point where it bankrupted Germany, who was already pretty bankrupt after fighting a war anyway, and they couldn't afford it, and it led to extreme politics coming out. You had the extreme left and the extreme right. As we know, in Germany, the extreme right won over in the end, mainly by proportional representation. They got into power. They burnt down the Reichstag, blamed it on the. They were really good at marketing, the Nazis. So they were horrible people, but they were good at selling their story. And they burnt the Reichstag down, as far as history tells us, and blamed it on the communists and fired at people against the communists. And that's how they got more and more votes, became the main powerful party in Germany. So all of these things happened because of economics. If everyone in Germany had been happy, getting along with things and not fighting through hyperinflation and all the rest of it that they went through, they wouldn't have voted for extremists. they wouldn't have had a platform. They wouldn't have resonated with how people were feeling. They wouldn't have pointed the finger and blame. So we're living through that right now. The death of politics? Not at all. The death, of democracy? Not at all. On the contrary, I think democracy is about people having the right to be heard and the right to vote. And therefore, having another vote can never be the death of democracy. It's exactly the opposite. Not having a vote is the death of democracy.
In relation to that point, and I think this is a direct quote, but if it's not a direct quote, then it's pretty close. If lying constituted a revote, we would be literally revoting on everything forever. And my response to this, and let me know what you think, is it isn't the fact that politicians lie which would cause a revote. It's if the lie is significant enough, there should be a revote. So he used Trump as examples a couple of times. And there was I think it's pronounced the Mueller investigation. And if it were the case that Trump was actually a Russian agent, which there was an investigation on, the fact that he won the election would be irrelevant. He wouldn't be president anymore. And so it's if the lies are significant enough to justify a revote rather than any lies at all. Do you see what I mean by that?
Yeah. I mean, there's always a witch hunt goes on, isn't there? You said this. I saw an interview with Nigel Farage the other day, and he quoted it. He said it was. I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was something along the lines of, "This is the most ridiculous interview I've ever had." And the reason he said that was because the interviewer, a very respected interviewer, Andrew Mars, the researchers had provided him with all these clips, video clips, etc., where Nigel Farage had said things that contradict what he's now saying, and he said, "Well, didn't you say this just a few years ago? And didn't you say that a few years ago?" I'm not going to go into what he said, and if you're interested, you can go on the BBC iPlayer and.
I've got some examples if you want to go into them.
What, of Nigel Farage?
It's actually it's the example that I had, which I think most people know about, is the red Brexit bus, quoting, "We send the EU £350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS instead. Vote leave." And because of this, Boris Johnson is facing private prosecution over the claim, and that happens next week.
Okay, interesting.
And it's an example of a lie which you'd have to say, does that justify?
Well, this is
maybe it doesn't, but does it justify?
Well, not only did but you have a right to change your mind. That's the thing. Even if you're a politician, you should be changing your mind, in my view. You shouldn't be, consistent with what you've. When you're a child, you may have all sorts of views, right? As you grow, as you get older, you should be consistently learning and adapting your views depending on how things go. If you're, I remember that there's a movie called The Mission. And my stepdad, we watched the movie called The Mission with Robert De Niro. Good movie. 1980s movie, something like that. And for penitence, for crimes that he's committed, he has to climb with a rock tied around him, climb this huge waterfall in the jungle. And I remember my stepdad said, "Oh, that's ridiculous," he said. He'd never be able to do that. And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, he'd freeze to death with all that water on him." And I thought, You're off your head. It's in the jungle. No one's ever frozen to death in the jungle. And this is what I mean. This is a perception. My stepfather came from the viewpoint where he'd always lived all his life in the UK. And if you tried to climb a waterfall in the UK, it's very cold water. And by the time you got to the top, you'd have frozen to death, I'm sure. But not in a hotter climate. And so you need to be open-minded and bring in new information and change your view. And now his view is different. He lives in Cuba now, of all places. Not because he's a lefty, but because he married a Cuban lady and property is considerably cheaper there. So anyway, he's changed his mind because new information for him came about. And he realised, actually, you're right, in a hot country you wouldn't freeze to death. And this is what I mean. Even Nigel Farage, who I don't like at all, I don't agree with almost universally on any of his issues, but even he has the right to change his mind. And in many ways he was correct, I think, to argue that this is a preposterous argument. It doesn't matter what I said back then. It matters what I'm saying now, because things change. And I'm changing with the times. And I agree with him on that. It's probably the only thing I agree with him on. But it was interesting that he attacked the interviewer and said, this is the most ridiculous interview I've ever had, or words to that effect, to defend himself against these accusations.
Not an argument, yeah.
Not an argument.
So in relation to that point within the video, he also gives examples about how the other side also lie, with the examples about 2/3 of the manufacturing jobs are dependent on the EU, and the average British family will be £4,300 worse off, or that unemployment rates would skyrocket. I'm open to labelling these as lies or errors once we have seen the ramifications of Brexit, but until we do, we don't know if they're true or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we do know that certain things, I mean, it's very difficult to measure these things, and we're relying on all sorts of surveys and statistics in any case. But yeah, we haven't actually left Europe yet. So, those things simply cannot be disproven because they're not there yet. What we can see is that, it's unlikely that some of these things will come about. But who knows how the economy is going to be, in 5 years' time, regardless of what the decision was.
It's also about a perception thing.
Perception.
So, meaning that if the perception is that if Brexit is terrible and is about to crash the economy, that has its own, let's say, if people start selling off in the stock market, for example, people might lose their savings or their retirement fund or something along those lines, and then property market might crash, something like that. We don't know what will happen, but it could, in theory, happen, so we have to just wait and see what.
One thing that was very clear is that, in my view, the immigration issue, by the way, has got zero to do with Brexit. I mean, ever since, if you ever fly from Spain to the UK or UK to Spain, then you have to not only show your passport when you go through, but you also have to type in your passport details in advance, minimum, I think, of 24 hours in advance of the flight. That's not the case with other people, with other countries. If you fly from Spain to Italy, they don't even have the right to ask you for a form of ID. You walk through, there's no passport control whatsoever. And if you drive over the border from Spain to France, there is actually, on the main border crossing, I've recently done it, from Spain to France, there is a border control, but they can't ask for your passports. They can check to see whether you're smuggling, I don't know, drugs or whatever it may be, but they can't check they don't have the right to check automatically for your passport. And when you go across the border between Spain and Portugal, there's no border crossing at all. If you go across from France into Switzerland, which isn't even part of the European Union, there is a border post, but it's unmanned most of the time, at least. So this is not having border. This is the Schengen Agreement, which we never were formed a part of. The UK has always actively sought and held the information of who comes across the border. And they always have done. The problem, I think, is a UK one, because they've had all this information, but it appears that they haven't done anything with it. They've wasted that information. They've been collecting this information for decades, and yet, if you ask a politician how many people from Europe are in the country, they give wild estimates because they just don't know. And this is a huge failing because, in actual fact, it's a rare occasion in Europe, the only occasion, as far as I'm aware, where they actually do know, or they have the information available, so they should know who's come and who's not, and when. But they just haven't acted upon that information. So that's not a failing of the European Union at all. That's a failing of the UK. Freedom of movement is a European thing, which we agreed to. when I've massively, as I said earlier, benefited from my own family. My children may not even have been born without it. So basically, it's mismanagement by the government, not by the European Union. It's the government's requirement to keep this information, to request these passports, and to request the information from the passports prior to even travelling. And if they don't keep the information and use it correctly, that's got nothing to do with the European Union at all, in my view.
Okay. Next example of a lie that he gave was he put the immediate, I believe it was David Cameron stating that they would immediately trigger Article 50 down as a lie if the British people were to vote leave. I think that, it was an intention, and perhaps you should have said it was our intention to do that, but I don't think anyone anticipated the complications of what would happen if the result was leave. I don't think anyone knew what kind of bureaucracy that would create. I don't think you could classify that as a lie.
It's naivety. One thing I would say, nice guy or not, I think David Cameron's one of the least effective leaders this country's ever had, certainly in my lifetime. And he's done the most damage. And, let's be honest, the swing was 1.5% or something between leave and remain, which is, for such a huge change, it's a very, very small swing. And most referendums would have required a bigger swing to make any real change.
He mentions Richard Dawkins in his video, and I think that might be valid if you said it before but not after.
Exactly, yeah.
So,
if you're coming for a referendum, if you're putting together how this process works, it just shows a tremendous naivety.
Yeah, it was totally unplanned.
But it massively worries me that people in power can make mistakes of that size. It's a real worry and a concern that I really haven't heard talked about. It's not an issue that I've come across very much. I'm sure many, many people are talking about it, but I've never heard a real discussion about, what's going wrong with politics. And in my views, coming back to the death of democracy that we mentioned earlier on, in some ways you could welcome it. Perhaps it's time for a change, and this is just demonstrating some of the real flaws that we have in our current system. And I'm not suggesting that we move away from democracy, quite the opposite. I feel that we have a system of democracy that's hundreds and hundreds of years old, that's been developed in a completely bygone time with different social systems in place. Women weren't even allowed to vote, for example. Slavery was legal back then, or at least I think it wasn't illegal, which is the difference. All sorts of things have changed since the birth of democracy, and yet democracy in this country has resolutely remained pretty much unchanged. It's time for it to evolve into something altogether more democratic. I don't know what exactly that looks like, but I know it doesn't look like the current party system.
We had a conversation in our Socrates episode, and I've reflected a little bit on that, about how is just complete democracy a good thing. And I think it's a bit controversial to say, but I think it's valid. I don't think you should be able to vote if you don't know what the policies of the party you're voting for are. But I know we've talked about that, so it's
just very briefly on that point. The current, with an analogy here in place, the current party system that we all see as tradition. This is how it is. Not enough people are sort of questioning the very fabric of our current system, and I'm not advocating revolution at all. Quite the opposite. I want evolution. There are traditions that are just plain wrong. The Aztecs, for example, and they can't defend themselves because they no longer exist as a homogenous group. But the Aztecs in the up until the end of the 15th century held human sacrifice as part of their tradition. Is that right? Do you defend that because it's part of tradition? You know, do you say, well, women haven't historically had the right to vote, so they shouldn't be allowed the right to vote? People have fought long and hard to force change, to make tradition change, and tradition never stays the same.
Yeah, it would be a fallacy anyway.
Yeah.
It would be an appeal to tradition.
Yeah.
We should do it because we've always done it.
And we should be evolving our political system because it's time to evolve. And what we're seeing now are the cracks in the current system. The current system is party politics. It's like, with the analogy I was about to say before, it's like I support one football team, you support another football team. You know, we go, and a debate in politics is like a football match where one is trying to beat the other. And you're going to always support your team, your party, regardless. And at the end of it, if you've come out the loser, then, well, that decision wasn't very good, that shouldn't have been a penalty, or that should have been a penalty, or that wasn't a free kick, and so on and so forth, because we all have this bias, inbuilt bias, that filters and colours our perception of everything. And so, you know, current party politics is you toe the party line and you have to remain consistent throughout your life to a particular party. And most people, when they vote Conservative because their father voted Conservative before them, or because their friends at school voted Conservative and they went to a school where people voted Conservative. It's just expected of you, which I did, by the way. I went to a school like that. Or Labour, or whatever it may be, you know. Everyone around you votes Labour, you go to the work, you're all workers and you're all voting Labour. And, you know, I've worked in a place where there was a guy who openly said he supported the Conservative Party, and, you know, he got a lot of stick around every time there was an election because most people supported Labour because they were workers. I mean, they were workers, they were middle-class, modern office workers, not traditional, you know, down the mines kind of guys, you know. So I just don't agree with that, and I think it's time for that party politics to change. We've got the ability now to be looking forward to the future and seeing what, with the technology, the level of technology that we've got today is not the same as it was 500 years ago. So we shouldn't have the same historical idea of democracy. Democracy can move on and be much more democratic. And therefore, having a vote is democracy, and people should, regardless of the outcome of the vote, whether you agree with it or not, it's a valid thing. You're asking the opinion of the people. Should people be able to vote when they don't know anything about what it is they're voting about? Well, ideally not. Ideally, we want to push people to educate themselves, you know, to find out before they vote. But in real terms, the vast majority of people vote Conservative without knowing any Conservative, or without knowing who, in their local election, you don't know who you're voting for. There's very little information. You vote Conservative because you naturally think that's the best one for you, or you vote Labour because you think that's the right one for you, or the Green Party, or the Liberal Democrats, or whoever it may be. But, you know, so I could argue that right now most people are voting without really doing their due diligence anyway.
Well, that might be a reason why the outcome is what it was. He does reference the silent majority in his video.
Yes.
And if it were the case that there was a second referendum, the silent majority would come out and vote the same way again.
Third referendum, I think you'll find.
Third referendum. But the title of the video is the second referendum.
Yeah.
And it's a small point. It's not really a philosophical point, but if it were the case that that was true, then there isn't much reason to object to another one. So if it was the case that we have another one and the silent majority come out and the result is the same, why bother in objecting to anything?
Exactly. I mean, it's a good point, and it comes back to the point of why people are frightened to have another referendum. I mean, the truth of the matter is, clearly we need some other vote because we've realised a stalemate. It's not going the way that anyone wanted. You know, it's like we're drifting downstream, or we're in a boat. No one's taking control of it, and it's just gradually going further and further out into the ocean. You know, it's time for somebody to take control. And you could say, well, we'll go this way or we'll go that way, but just to be wandering off to be being drifted off by the current where no one wants to go is ridiculous. And so it's time to do something. We've reached a stalemate. The people who voted to leave haven't got what they wanted, and they're already feeling betrayed by that. The people who voted to remain have been largely ignored. I've heard so many times 17.4 million people have voted. The 17.4 million people. There are nearly 65 million people in this country. So it's a very small number of people who voted to leave anyway. This is another argument. Who should have the right to vote? Should everyone be able to vote? Should there be a certain age limit, or so on and so forth? I have no interest in that. The truth of the matter is, I didn't vote to go, and no one, it seems, is standing up for me. Apparently, democracy has had its say. 17.4 million people all the time. I know that figure because it's been said so many times. I don't know the figure of how many people voted to remain, because hardly anyone's ever mentioned it, because apparently these people no longer count. And after the local elections, when the government, the Conservatives got absolutely slaughtered in the local elections and lost over, I think it's something like 1,400 council seats. Hugely, did awful, way worse than they even thought they were going to. And then I heard people actually speaking for me again, saying, look, the people have voted. And this is someone speaking on my behalf and yours and everybody else's. The people have voted, and they've sent a very clear message. The message is that we should be getting on with Brexit. And there's two main problems that I have with that comment. First is that he's interpreting the results of the election, because people have said they're not happy with what's going on. But I certainly never said it's time to get on with Brexit. That wasn't what I was voting for. I haven't been heard since that referendum. I did not vote. He's interpreted my vote and millions of other votes by his own perception filter, by his own bias, and said, clearly they're saying that they're not happy with us and we need to get on with Brexit. No, you've got it all wrong. Some people are saying that and some people are not. The point is, you shouldn't be trying to interpret something like that. You should be going back to the people and asking them, what do you really mean? And the only way they can do that is to say, and this is the other thing. I've not heard this said, and maybe it has been said or whatever. My daughter came up with an answer. She said, it's really obvious, isn't it, Daddy? And I said, what? She said, well, you've got politicians saying, Theresa May, for example, saying, the people have voted, we can't have another referendum because we need to enact what they've said. We promised we're going to do that and we're going to do it. And yet she's tried to get her own deal, exit deal or Brexit deal. She's been trying to get that through Parliament, and it failed. So then she takes she does it again, puts the same vote up again, and it failed. And then she put the same vote up again. 3 times it failed, the same vote. And yet she's the very same person who said that we can't have a second referendum until it's been enacted. So either there's a bit of hypocrisy going on there, or she's just, what is she? She's a liar? She's mad? I don't know. She certainly shouldn't be in power, in my view, because she's not making a good job of it. But it annoys me again that we have my daughter, who at the time was, I think, 11, said, surely she should be asking the people. It's obvious. If you don't know whether the people want a referendum or not, a second referendum, or actually a third, surely you just ask the people, do you want a second referendum? And that answers it. If they said to the people, right, we're going to have a vote now, a public vote, do you or do you not want a second referendum? And the people say, no, we don't want a second referendum, that's the answer. If the people say, yes, we do want a second referendum, then there's no betrayal of policy. The people have spoke again and they say, yes, we want a second referendum. The outcome of that second referendum, if they were to, or third in actual fact, the outcome of the new referendum would be by consensus. The people have said that they wanted that referendum, or not.
This comes into the next point which was he does take the hypothetical, which is to say that if the case that people had changed their minds, it wouldn't be a justification for a revote. To a certain degree, I was going to say I agree with this in principle, but the follow-up question I would say is there a valid reason for it? So
for what? Sorry.
For another revote. And I would say that if you voted for something on, which is the 23rd of June 2016, and it's almost been 2 years, and the government hasn't been able
almost 3
to
years.
implement that vote. Well, yeah, it's been 2.5. Yeah, almost 3 years rather.
Almost
That's my maths going a bit wrong there. And government hasn't been able to implement that. There's every reason to ask the people again, as if they do change their minds, you are saving a lot of potentially unnecessary suffering. So I think he said, and this isn't a quote, but I think he said in the video that if you implemented it and then you asked again, even if it was in the short term, that would be a form of democracy. But if there's valid reason for doing it, and you can not have a negative impact on that well-being of people, let's say loss of, I don't know, millions of jobs or whatever it might be, surely that's positive that you
absolutely.
have.
I mean, it's crazy. Going back to the analogy of a game of football, you come into the game of football and you want to, you've got a plan of action, right? You're going to try this, but the game doesn't pan out the way you want. So what do? Nothing? No, of course not. At half time, before the game is ended, you say, you know what, we've tried it. It's not working the way we thought. We're going to have to try something else. That's one analogy. Another analogy would be if you're driving the car and you go the wrong direction, do you continue driving down that direction until you reach the end of the road? No, of course not. You say, you know what, let's have a look at the map, or ask someone directions, or actually put that damn sat-nav on, for God's sake. You reassess and then you change direction if that's appropriate. That's just what you do. It's crazy to make a decision and then follow through with it regardless of the outcome. Imagine what would have happened in the Second World War if we've had that kind of thinking, Well, we're going to continue attacking in the First World War, the Somme. We're just going to send more and more. And this is basically what happened. And how many millions of people were killed in the Battle of the Somme? I can't remember off the top of my head. But it was basically, well, our plan of action is just to walk our soldiers through there. Didn't work, we'll try it again. And again and again. I mean, there comes a time when you realise that things haven't panned out the way you wanted. And you have to try something else. And as a businessman, Tom, that's the case all the time. You're constantly having to adapt and change. Otherwise, you find yourself wildly out of touch with the reality of what's going on. You've got to. It's part of being a human.
So the next one, I think, is a pretty easy one in terms of recognising a fallacy. In reference to the argument about demographics and how they've changed and how that might give a different result. It's not a big thing, but the term spitting on the graves and also have some bloody respect, that would be a fallacy. Sometimes called an appeal to emotion or an argument from passion. The definition of that is an attempt to manipulate the recipient's emotions in order to win an argument instead of using logic and reason.
Yeah.
But at the very least, it presupposes that someone is not showing respect simply because they want a second referendum or they disagree. So
I would argue
where there may be a valid reason.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I would argue that people have the right to change their mind, and if someone has died because they've got old and they've died and they can no longer... who are you to speak for them? Someone says something one day and then they change their mind. But if they're dead, you're speaking on their behalf. Remember, no mind spitting on their grave. Who are you just to say, because they said this now, if they were alive today, they would still say that in the future? They may. They probably would, but they might not. You're supposing that that's the case. And it's irrelevant anyway, because, at various times in our past, people have voted for all sorts of things that you wouldn't vote for now. People change their mind, So, again, it comes down to the fact that, it's not about respect. It's disrespectful to assume you know what someone else is going to say just because at one point in the past they said something. That's true. So it's just as disrespectful as what he was saying.
So the next, in reference to the referendum being advisory, he states there would be staggering costs, quote unquote, if it were ignored, and the relationship between the government and the people would be absolutely obliterated. This is, again, very emotive language, and you only have to use a hypothetical to disprove it. An example of that might be if a second referendum achieves a, let's say, 80% Remain vote, the relationship would be just fine. So let's say in the hypothetical where we did have another one, and it was overwhelmingly Remain, there'd be nothing wrong with that relationship.
Yeah,
and so
right.
it's not a valid claim.
I think that this is the fear thing as well, and I think I'm very sorry to say I believe that he is coming from a defensive point of view, and he's defending the current political status quo, because yes, you're probably right. It probably would feel like a massive betrayal for a lot of people. For a lot of other people, it wouldn't, and they wouldn't, and for many other people, they wouldn't care one way or the other. But there would and always are a lot of people are going to be unhappy about whatever result comes through. And it's true to say that if you vote for something and then the government ignore it or don't implement it, then they have betrayed your vote. They've betrayed your trust in them. This is true. As I said, a way to get around that is to not have a second referendum, but first to have a vote on, to actually ask the people, do you even want a second referendum? Because if the people say no, then that's that. If the people say overwhelmingly, yes, let's have a second referendum and batter this out once and for all, then the people have spoken. There's no betrayal. You can't then say, well, they betrayed what we voted for, because they didn't.
An interesting analogy there, actually, in the sense that if I was to ask you something and you were very, serious about what you wanted, and let's say I attempted to implement what it was, but I was having trouble with it. If I was to then come back to you and say, are you sure? And you said, yeah, definitely, I'm sure. Then I could go back and attempt to implement it.
Yeah.
But if you were to say, well, actually, don't worry about that. I was, it's a mistake on my part, or whatever the reason might be. Don't worry about it this time. That would save a lot of, hassle in some instances.
Yeah, that's right. That actually happens every day, doesn't it, in our line of work? So you basically get somebody saying, "Can you implement this change to something?" And you say, "Oh, okay, if that's really what you want to do, we'll implement it." And then you go away, and for whatever reason you can't implement it, or you, even if you did implement it and it doesn't work, then you come back to them. But let's just say, to remain in this analogy, you can't implement that change they've required. It may not have been that big a deal for them in the first place. We don't even know. We're supposing that it's a huge and important deal for them. But I think the fear that, and this is within the Tory party and also the Labour Party, especially the Labour Party, is that if we look at the Labour Party, traditionally, most Labour supporters were pro-Europe. Not all, but this is the party politics thing again. You have to be in line with your party, right? So the majority of them were pro-Europe, and when it came out to the Brexit vote, the majority of people who voted to leave Europe were traditionally in Labour strongholds, which has shattered Labour, because they're saying, well, traditionally we want to be pro-Europe. But if we vote pro-Europe, we're alienating a large number of people who would otherwise vote for us. And therefore, we're neither pro nor anti-Europe. We're betraying everyone because we're not standing up for our beliefs. And this is another problem, in my view, with party politics. The whole reason we have a referendum is because the Conservative Party was falling apart, and it was a way of trying to keep it together. the main reason, and I might be wrong on that, there may be other reasons, but as far as I can tell, that was the main reason we had it in the first place, and it failed. And it's also failed with the Labour Party, and now you've got two completely ineffective parties that are tearing themselves apart because they're at war with themselves, because they're finding that actually we can't align with traditional party values because we no longer know what those party values are. So, yeah, would it have tremendous detrimental effects if a disastrous effect, or whatever the word was that he used? Should we do this? Well, maybe to the current political parties it would. Maybe it wouldn't. But overall, I don't think so. I think it would probably benefit us.
He goes on to say that it would send a crystal clear message that you are free to vote for whatever you want, so long as you vote according to our preferences.
Mm-hmm.
And it'd be my position that this presupposes this is what the government is saying. Maybe it's the case that the government has concerns about the well-being of the vulnerable if Brexit is implemented, and is potentially doing everything to avoid that. So it may be acting in our best interests to stop it.
And we don't know it.
It's a presupposition essentially within that claim.
Yeah, I go along with that. Yeah.
Just finalising, in a couple of instances, he states the second referendum would be forced upon people. He uses that terminology a couple of times, and in a referendum, you don't have to vote, so it is not force. And it's an important distinction, essentially.
Yes, that's right. You don't have to vote. In Australia, you do by law. Otherwise, you get fined. But in the UK, you don't have to vote. So you're right. It's a choice to vote whether you vote or not, and it's a choice what you vote on. That was the case in the first referendum, and it would be the case in the second. In fact, I would say it was the case in the second and would be the case in the third, because let's not forget, we've already had two referendums, one in 1975, which people forget about. And it may be that we say, well, that wasn't a referendum, that was whether we wanted to join the European Union, because we were outside the European Union, so maybe it's not the same thing. But it kind of is, right? It's about whether to be in or out of the European Union. It came at that point from a position of being outside the European Union, which was then slightly different. It's changed over the years, and it was called the EEC, the European Economic Community. But it's basically an evolution of the same thing. It's just changed, it's rebranded, but it's the same thing. And people are fearful that it's becoming more federal and this, that, and the other. But this is another argument. And I'm not pro-Europe in the way it's currently set up at all. But yeah, I think that comes back to the same point that I made earlier, that if you simply ask the people, do you want another referendum, and the people say yes or the people say no, then that kind of, if you like, to use his own terminology, debunks that argument.
Well, in terms of a video which debunks the second referendum based on what we've talked about today, I don't think that meets the criteria for it being debunked. I think that you made a good point about the just asking, would you like one?
It's very easy, isn't it? It's very obvious, really. My 11-year-old daughter said that.
Apparently it isn't obvious.
No, apparently not. But
also I think, based on the time that's gone past, I think there's every reason, if you were to say beforehand, if the government has been unable to implement it, what would be a reasonable time to ask again? And I think, 2 or 3 years, I don't think is unreasonable, actually. But I would also note that although that we've addressed some of the what I would say fallacies are within the argument, I think he is a positive good, because anyone who's talking about reason, especially on YouTube, I think that's a positive thing.
Yeah, I agree. It was a breath of fresh air, actually, his video, and I don't think it's a bad video at all. I think it's a very good video.
Would you like to conclude about what you think should happen regarding, I know what it would be, but regarding a second referendum, or what you'd like to conclude?
I'd just like to say another thing that I don't think anyone has addressed at this point is that every 4 to 5 years, by law, we have to have another, essentially, referendum on who is going to be in power. So we have a general election. So we all decide once every 4 to 5 years whether we want the Conservatives or whether we want the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats or any other party who it may be. Usually, in my lifetime, certainly, it's always been the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. And look at how many times we've changed our opinion over the years. So why is that any different? We can change our opinion on being in European Union or not. I don't, nearly 3 years have gone by. Well, we've had general elections much sooner than within 3 years.
What the other side would say, supposedly, is that when those votes happen, the change happens. So if you vote Labour and then vote Conservative, you expect to have a Conservative government.
No, that's a fair point, yeah. You don't always get it. We had coalition parties and stuff like that as well.
That's true, yeah. And not for lack of trying as well. It's not as if they haven't voted Brexit because they weren't trying to do it.
No. But yeah, no, it's just another point. I hadn't really thought it through in detail. In my view, if I were in charge right now, I'd say, look, we've reached a stalemate, regardless of whether you want to be, pro Brexit or pro Remain. I think the obvious solution is to simply ask the people: do you want, yes or no, another vote on Brexit? And if the people say yes, then we have another Brexit vote. If the people say no, then we don't have another Brexit vote, and we implement, regardless, the change, or we continue this stalemate for us until the time comes again to ask the people, do you now want a second vote? Because, to be honest, you either implement something or you don't. And currently, we're failing to implement something. And the main reason is because we're not going to get the desired outcome. So why would you want to implement something that is absolutely hurting you?
This is something he alluded to in the video, which is control of the borders. I think that's one of the major issues around the whole thing. And you mentioned it about how freedom of movement thing, and I think that's predominantly what's behind the vote in the first place. So
I think you're right. For most people, that is a big issue. And I've been to places where I've seen what's happened when large numbers of immigrants from a specific country come in and change the makeup of a certain community that's been there for generations and generations, and changes everything. And it has a massive negative impact on the people who've always lived there, who no longer know their neighbours or can't speak the language and all the rest of it. I'm not saying this is the reason everyone has voted for it. This is something that's never affected me, and I consider myself to be a very liberal person. And I've got to be honest, I'm all in favour, or I think we've benefited hugely in this country from immigrants who've come in, and they've, that our food has improved no end, and our understanding of other cultures, and our music and all sorts of things have massively benefited from the mix of cultures. I myself married someone from Spain, and my children have two different ethnicities. They come from Spain and they come from the UK, and I think that this fusion of two different cultures, or 3 or 4 or 5 or however many you can have, it gives you a greater understanding, a more balanced view of the world in general, and I'm all in favour of it. But I have seen firsthand how, if you've lived in the same community all your life, you've always known your neighbours, and it's always been like that. And it hasn't been a bed of roses. It hasn't always been great. It's been maybe tough. People with a good, solid working class background. Everyone's worked. Suddenly now, this influx of people from a different culture have come along, different language. The jobs have dried up. There aren't as many jobs for one reason or another, and that's nothing potentially to do with the immigrants, or maybe it's got everything to do with the immigrants. I'm not going to talk about that. But they come in, and it has a huge impact on your local area. And to your view, if you lived there, you've seen a lot of changes that aren't necessarily positive to you. You may have seen even house prices drop as a result, because other people, the majority of people, would no longer want to move to that area because they'd feel excluded by this monoculture that's now moved in. These are factors that people don't really talk about, and perhaps are scared to talk about. And I'm talking about it because, to me, it was quite an interesting thing. I've never seen that. Where I come from is middle class. We haven't had this problem. We haven't really seen it firsthand. And I understand that my perception filter, my native bias, is from a point of kind of privilege, if you like, because it hasn't impacted me directly. So I understand that was much more of an issue to a lot of people than it was to me. And I'll vote to stay in Europe because I like to be able to go to France or Spain or whatever, and whenever I fancy. And most people don't do those things. So it impacted me. Leaving Europe, it will impact me and has impacted me financially, way more than it will most English people.
Well, just so people are aware, there's an audiobook on our website, jandtpodcast.com, and it is Our Politics, if you want to know more about our positions on that type of subject. My position, just in summary, is that it's about the individual's beliefs. It's not about the country or the number of people that are coming. It's about what do those people believe. So just in case people are wondering.
And I would encourage people to move with the times and be open to new ideas and new information, and don't be consistent with your views that came before. My views when I was a child were very different to how I am now, and maybe my views in 10 years' time will be very different to how they are right now. Maybe in 10 years' time, Tom, you and I will look back at these podcasts and go, oh my God, did we really say that? That's what we thought.
I hope it's not too much like that, otherwise we're doing something wrong.
But my views now are completely different from when I was a teenager, in many ways, because, you should feel empowered to take on new information and change your mind and evolve your mind and grow, and not just steadfastly defend ideas because at some point you realise something. When I was at school, I was really into geography, and I was brilliant at geography. I looked at maps, and I was really, really kind of geeky about it. And I knew all the countries. I could draw from memory within minutes, just from memory, a really accurate map of the world, and I could put all where the countries were, and I could label them, and I could label their capital cities. Easy, because I spent so much time looking at maps. And really irritatingly, people came along and changed where countries' boundaries were. Yugoslavia doesn't exist today. You got Serbia and Croatia and all these places, Bosnia-Herzegovina and all that, and capital cities and other cities, Bombay, Mumbai, Madras, I don't even know what they call it now. Things change, places change, and it's frustrating to people. You learn something, you know something. I knew all the countries on the map, I knew all their capital cities. Wouldn't it be wonderful if they never changed anything and it all remained exactly the same? That way, I'd know it and never have to continue learning. Life isn't like that. Things change. You've got to keep up with the times, and you should be able to realise and recognise that you're not always right, and adapt your thinking. So, yeah, that's my summary is just keep an open mind and feel empowered to change your mind if you think that's the right thing to do. Leave your perception filter and your bias at home. There you go.
Okay, buddy. Thanks for participation.
Well, thank you. Thank you for drawing my attention to the video. It was a good one.
Until the next episode.
Indeed.